Hey everybody, this is Tech and Data Tips for Business People. Today we're going to be talking about merging two datasets using Power Query. If you have two tables that have some data that overlaps but they're not the same dataset, and you want to combine those two datasets into one big one and run some data analysis or use pivot tables on it, then Power Query has a merge function that does just this. You can kind of think of this as an alternative to VLOOKUP or index match. And in some ways, it's actually a lot better because it has the opportunity to automate some of these tasks of getting data from one table and putting it into another. An example of how this might be used is if you have a transaction table and a lookup table, and you want to retrieve data from the lookup table that is not in the transaction table, and then you want to get all the fields into one big data set. This is a very useful tool, and it does have some drawbacks, which I will be talking about at the end, but this is actually like a really good tip that I think that if anybody uses VLOOKUP or index match a lot and find it tiresome or they have to repeat themselves a lot, merge might be something that you might want to look into. So let's just say that we have two separate files that we downloaded from somewhere. One is a transactions file and one is a product table. So let's go ahead and load these into Excel using Power Query. I'll be going through the loading process pretty quickly. If you want to get a more detailed overview of how to do this, please refer to another video that I made about automating data loads into Excel. First, let's go ahead and load the product table. Usually it's good practice to transform the data, but for brevity's sake, for this particular tutorial, we don't really need to do that. However, I do want to use load to instead of load, because when you click on load to, it gives you the option to add the data to the data model, which is necessary for us to use the merge function. So make sure you click on load to and then check on add this data to the data model if you want to use the merge function. In general, it's a good practice to add any data that you load using Power Query to add it also to the data model. Okay, so let's go ahead and load the transactions table. Load to. And add this data to the data model. Okay. So what we're going to do now is click on Query and go to Edit. This view is called the Power Query Editor, and here you can do a lot of like data cleaning and data manipulations, and all the steps will be recorded here, and you can change the steps or delete them. And this is kind of a way of automating a lot of tedious tasks that you might have to do with manipulating Excel files or data files. So here you actually see that both the product table and the transactions are present. What we want to do is take the transactions table, and you see how there's a product ID here, but there's no other information about any of the products in the transactions table. It just has a product ID. But the product table has a lot of information about individual products, and it does also have a corresponding product ID. So both these tables have one thing in common, which is that they both have a product ID. See, the transaction table has it, and so does the product table. So what we want to do, potentially, because say we want to just combine the two data sets, and we want to have one transaction table that contains not just this information, but we also want to get the information from the product table into this transaction table. Normally what you might do is use VLOOKUP or index match, and those are fine, but in a lot of ways they're kind of manual, and Power Query's merge can actually help you automate a lot of that. So how to do that, you click on the table that you want to merge the data into. So we want to get a bigger transactions table, right? So we start with that one, and then you click on merge queries, and there's actually two options. Merge queries, what it does is it will merge data from another table into this current table. Merge queries as new, it actually creates an entirely new query or table, and it has like a bigger data set that combines the transactions table and the product table into an entirely new data set, which so that means there's going to be a third data set. Let's go ahead and do that because maybe we want to keep this transaction table for some reason. So we'll click on merge queries as new. Now when you get to this screen here, you want to make sure that the first table that you've selected here is the one that you want to merge data into. So this is the one, this is the correct one. We want to make the transaction table bigger. And then the other table is product table. And then next you want to select the two fields that are the same in both tables. So you have product ID here in the transactions table, and you also have product ID here in the product table. Okay, and then lastly, the thing you want to pay attention to is the kind of join. Now if you click on this drop down, you'll see there's a whole lot of different kinds of joins. For the purpose of this tutorial, we will be using left outer. What that means is that we will take all of the data from the first data set here, which is transactions, but only the data from the second table, the product table, that matches with the first. So we won't have all the data in the product table appear. Only the data that matches up with the product IDs in the transactions table will have their information appear in the new table. And typically, most of the time, you're going to be using left outer for these kinds of merging, where you want to have you want to take data from one table and get it into another one, but you don't want all of these empty rows potentially. So this is what we want. We want product ID is the joining fields, and then transactions and product table are the two tables you want to join or merge, and then you want to use the left outer join. So click OK. So once you do that, you see that there's another query here, another table. Maybe we'll call this transactions detailed because it has more detail. It has all these product, has the information for the products. And you'll notice that these fields here, all the way up to quantity, are the original fields in the transactions table. But then you have this extra column here. It says product table, and then it has like all these like table text over here. So you're not done yet. You need to click on this and then select all of the columns in the product table that you want to retrieve and merge into this transactions table. So let's say you want all of them, but you don't want the product ID again, because essentially that's going to be a duplicate of this product ID field. So if you want all the fields in the product table, what you would do is just make sure select all columns is selected, and then you just deselect product ID, and you'll get all of the other fields in product table. And then click OK. And then you're done here. You just need to go to load And make sure you close and load to, because you want to get this prompt where they ask you if you want to add this data to the data model, and you definitely want that, so you say okay. So now you have this extra table that is essentially the transactions table with a lot of extra fields that are merged into it from the product table. And likely if you don't use merge and you just have these two data sets here, these two sheets here with the product and transactions, you would probably end up just doing VLOOKUP here, right? But merge kind of does this in a more efficient and seamless way. So that's kind of the merge function in a nutshell. As I said before, merging does have its downsides. It creates one big data set, and although the data sets we used were not really big, they can be very large, and if you merge two very large data sets with many rows and or many columns, you can have a lot of duplication of data, and the file can get really enormous. So the file can get really bloated, and it can become very unwieldy. So there actually is an alternative that reduces the size of the data, but it kind of achieves everything that you might want to use merge to achieve with. So typically you want to have one big data frame so you can do data analysis on it or run pivot tables on it. But another way to go about this is this, and it's a three-step process, and we will talk about this at a later date. But in short, number one is you first use Power Query to load multiple data sets, as we just did. And then number two, you create relationships between data sets. In other words, you're writing a data model where you're having those individual data sets connected in some manner, just like what we did previously with the product ID fields. And then lastly, once you have that relationship or the data model, you can use something called Power Pivot, which is kind of like the sister to Power Query, that allows you to pivot data that exists across multiple tables, not just it allows you to deal with data that is on multiple tables that are connected as opposed to just one big data set, which is traditionally the capability of pivot tables. So Power Pivot you can kind of think of as pivot tables and steroids. So that's for another date. And this probably sounds a little complicated if you've never heard about this before, but I promise I'll try to make it as seamless as possible. Until then, thanks for watching and have a nice day.